going to be talking about eating clean and what does that mean. So a little bit about me. My name is Carol Ann. I am currently a graduate student and dietetic intern at UAB. I graduated undergrad in 2015, where I studied biochemistry. And since then, I've had kind of a range of experiences. I had some really cool jobs in the food and restaurant industry. I got to travel around to places like California to open new restaurants and create training materials. I was the assistant director of an educational farm program at Camp McDowell, where we taught classes about sustainable agriculture, animal husbandry, cooking, food science classes with farm produce, and more. After that, we were shut down for a while for COVID, so I worked at a publishing company. That was a cool experience. I got to learn a lot about marketing and event planning. So it was during that time that I decided to go back to school and get further into nutrition. Discovered that I really loved education, and as a biochemistry person, I was really interested in learning more about nutrition from that aspect, and using that knowledge to help people be healthier or manage chronic diseases. So the objectives for this presentation, we are going to discuss the different definitions of clean eating, understand why processed foods should be eaten in moderation, learn the evidence-based benefits to eating whole and diverse foods, learn what to include and exclude in your diet, and finally, we'll discuss the balance and harms of restrictive eating. So first, we're going to talk about what is clean eating. So this is kind of a buzz phrase. I know I've seen this around a lot, especially since social media got really big. But it's a little confusing because it's often not defined, or it's defined in many different ways. So I went and did some searches to see what are some different definitions of clean eating that are out there. So I've kind of gathered 3 different definitions and put them here. This first one says eating foods that are as close as possible to their natural state. So that's a pretty good definition. It's not super specific. We're going to get a little more specific as we go through these. So the next one says clean eating may also be associated with terms like plant-based, grass-fed, sugar-free, or gluten-free. So getting a little more specific there, a little more exclusionary. And then finally, we see clean eating, minimally processed, natural, GMO-free, hormone-free, no antibiotics added, and local. So it's starting to get to be something that's really not very attainable anymore, the more specific you get down this route. So what I did was took a lot of these adjectives that are used in these definitions, and I did a search to see what really the health effects are of these attributes in eating this way. So I searched PubMed with these attributes and looked for outcomes that included reduced mortality and lowered incidence of chronic disease and cancer. So what I found was that there is a lot of evidence that eating non or minimally processed foods does have direct health benefits. As far as these others, I didn't find that specifically. There are a lot of reasons why people might ascribe to these diet patterns, antibiotic-free, hormone-free, etc. Some of those reasons include an existing chronic disease or condition. If you are a diabetic, then you might be limiting carbohydrates, limiting your sugar intake. Or if you are celiac, you probably are on a gluten-free diet. Other reasons could include environmental concerns, animal welfare, economic sustainability. So I'm not saying that there aren't good reasons why people might eat this way, but I do want to point out that there is insufficient evidence to say that anything besides this very first non or minimally processed foods attribute have personal direct health benefits. There's also not sufficient evidence right now to say that they cause harm. And finally, I will say that a lot of these are currently being investigated right now. We do not know everything at this point, so it's important to kind of stay on top of that research. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on the very first attribute, non or minimally processed foods versus eating ultra processed foods. And that is where I'm coming from when I'm going to be talking about clean eating, is going to be reducing ultra processed food intake. So what are processed foods? Processed foods are foods that have been altered in any way from their natural state. There are a lot of reasons why we process foods. The main one is to extend shelf life, to improve or enhance quality is another reason, prevent damage, and other reasons. Some of those reasons might be producing a quality that wasn't present in the first place, which is something you'll see a lot in ultra processed foods. So there's a classification system that started in 2016 called the NOVA classification. NOVA is not an acronym, it's just the name. So what NOVA does is they group foods into 4 different categories according to the extent and the purpose of industrial processing. So in group 1 foods, you're going to have unprocessed or very minimally processed foods. That's going to be your fruits and vegetables. Maybe they've been washed or treated to extend shelf life. Group 2 foods are processed culinary ingredients. So that could be butter made from milk or sugar from cane, or this first picture I have up here is a grain that has been milled. So that would be a group 2 food. Group 3 includes foods that are 2 or 3 ingredients. They're simple products made by adding salt, sugar, or adding a group 2 food to a group 1 food. So an example, fresh baked bread would be a group 3 food. You have a group 2 food, which would be your flour. And then you add things like water or salt, etc., into that to make your dough. And finally, group 4 foods are going to be where the danger lies. These are your ultra processed foods, and these are ready to eat convenience foods. There are often more than 5 ingredients present, and they have additives that are used to imitate primary foods. So some ingredient characteristics of ultra processed foods, those are foods with no or rare culinary use, including sugar, protein, and oil derivatives. So these are things like high fructose corn syrup, that would be a sugar derivative, protein isolates, hydrogenated oils. They also have cosmetic additives, so that could be color, flavor enhancers, emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, etc. And those are designed to make the final product more palatable. This slide just shows some examples in the different categories. So like I said, your minimally processed foods going to be your vegetables. Milk would be a minimally processed food. It is pasteurized, which is a process. And then your processed foods, most of these are either transformative cooking techniques or things that are done to extend the shelf life of these items, like canning or milling your flour. And then finally, your ultra processed foods. These are the foods where if you looked at their nutrition label, you would probably see some things that you did not recognize. So we're going to take a closer look of what is in ultra processed foods. And you may see me use the acronym UPF. So just know that that is going to refer to ultra processed foods. So we're looking at a Totino's party pizza as a example for an ultra processed food. So some characteristics that you're going to see is ultra processed foods often have low nutrient density. And nutrient density is the amount of beneficial nutrients present in proportion to mass. They're also going to have high caloric value often. And the nutrient distribution is going to be high sodium, added sugars, sometimes trans fats, and in the absence of trans fats, usually there's a high amount of saturated fat. So we're going to look at the nutrient distribution of a Totino's pizza here. So the first thing we're going to look at the calories. So let's say we are assessing a person who's on a 2,000 calorie diet. That's their normal energy intake for the day. So 690 for dinner, let's say you're only eating this pizza for dinner, that's really not a bad number for calories. But if you're looking at the way that those calories are distributed, it's really not a nutrient-dense food. So looking at the daily values here for the whole pizza, you've got 45% of your total fat intake and 48% of your saturated fat intake for the whole day. You also are going to have a really high sodium intake. So that's 60% of the recommended sodium intake for the day. Carbohydrates, 27%, that's adequate. Fiber is only 13%, that's really low. And then finally, the protein, we don't have a percentage here because everyone's protein needs are different. But for an adult with no existing conditions who just is eating protein to maintain, that's pretty low. That's going to be probably an inadequate protein intake for that meal. I do also want to point out that in America, dinner tends to be the biggest meal of the day. So proportionally, dinner should have a lot of good vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, etc. So now looking at the ingredient list. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how to break this list down. So you're going to see some bolded words and some words that are unbolded. So the bolded words are your main ingredients, and then that's going to have what all is in that ingredient. So just in the flour, you can see that you've got wheat flour, niacin, ferrous sulfate, thiamine mononitrate. So a lot of these are vitamins that have been added back into the flour. Some other things that you're going to see, not necessarily at the specific label, but in a lot of ultra processed foods, some general things that you see are going to be artificial dyes, artificial sweeteners, artificial flavorings, monosodium glutamate or MSG, which a lot of you probably know about. And then, like I said in that other slide, sugar, protein, and oil derivatives. So these are things that would not be used as a culinary ingredient. They're used to mimic other foods. And finally, you're going to see preservatives. So just about a couple of these substances, we don't know everything there is to know about what one specific thing in here is going to be harmful to you. That's something that's being investigated right now. I will say for artificial dyes, there was a recent review from 2022. 64% of the studies included in that review had a positive association between negative behavioral impact in children and food dyes. And most of those were statistically significant. So what are the health effects of ultra-processed foods? We're going to look kind of in depth at a recent review that studied ultra-processed foods and health outcomes. These were the health outcomes that were in this review that we're going to look at in detail. Overweight and obesity, cardiometabolic risks, cancer, various types of cancer, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, irritable bowel syndrome, depression and frailty concerns, all-cause mortality, and asthma. There is also evidence now that dementia would be included in this list as well. So this is the review that we're going to take a look at. So you don't need to read this giant paragraph, I'll summarize it for you. There were 43 studies included in this review. 37 of those studies found that ultra-processed food exposure was associated with at least one of those health outcomes on the previous slide. Not one of the studies reported a beneficial outcome. One of these studies was a randomized controlled trial, and we're going to look at that in detail. So a randomized controlled trial is going to be a study that can show cause and effect. Most of the other studies were observational. So this is the randomized controlled trial, or RCT, that was included in this study. So what they did was they followed 20 weight-stable adults that did not have existing conditions. In the experimental group, they were given a diet with 81.3% of energy from ultra-processed foods, and the control group had 0% of their diet from ultra-processed foods. These diets were matched exactly for calories, sugar, fat, sodium, fiber, and micronutrients in excess of their needs. So that means that the participants could eat as much as they wished from one of these diets. There was more there than they needed. And what they found was that participants on the ultra-processed food diet had increased energy intake and weight gain. Also, those on the unprocessed food diet actually had weight loss. So I just want to point out, so a randomized control trial can indicate cause and effect relationships. So this is a really important study. And what it means is that it's not just the calories, the sugar, and the fat in ultra-processed food that make people gain weight or lead to these adverse health outcomes. So there's more at play here. These people were eating more of the ultra-processed diet than the unprocessed diet. So that might indicate that there could be some hormone signaling that's off. Maybe your body isn't recognizing that you're full or you're eating more of that specific food. There are some other mechanisms that we're going to talk about in just a minute as well. I will say that energy intake and weight gain were highly correlated here. So it makes sense that the people on the ultra-processed food diet, they were eating more and they were gaining weight. Just to summarize a little bit, these were some of the results that they had from those other health outcomes. So 3 of the 5 studies had an increased occurrence of metabolic syndrome related to their ultra-processed food consumption. Breast cancer, those that had a regular consumption of ultra-processed foods, and that was defined as they were eating ultra-processed foods greater than 5 days a week, had a 2.3 times higher odds of breast cancer. Cardiovascular disease also had increased risk of CVD, coronary heart disease, and cerebrovascular disease, respectively. Type 2 diabetes had a 10% increase in ultra-processed foods in their diet was associated with that 15% higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And finally, mortality. Those participants that were in the highest quartile of ultra-processed food consumption had a 31% higher risk of all-cause mortality. So these are some of the proposed mechanisms of effects. How are we getting to these negative health outcomes? So the first one is pretty self-explanatory. So ultra-processed foods have added sugars, sodium, and trans fats, or high saturated fat, higher than unprocessed or minimally processed foods. Displacement of minimally processed foods in the diet. So that MPF is minimally processed. So if you're eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, you're probably also eating less minimally or unprocessed foods. So you're not getting the health benefits that come from eating lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains. Higher glycemic load. So when I see higher glycemic load, I think of that eventually leading to insulin resistance or potentially leading to insulin resistance, which can cause metabolic syndrome. Reduced gut-brain satiety signaling due to altered physical properties of food. So that's hormones. So you're thinking about hormones here. We have hormones that tell us when we're hungry and when it's time to stop eating. And this is a big area of nutrition research. So it could be that the hormone signaling is off here. Carcinogens form during high temperature cooking. So we know that for ultra-processed foods, often frying or deep frying is used, and carcinogens can be formed during the cooking of that oil. Finally, inflammatory responses linked with additives. Eating a lot of those additives or those foreign kind of substances in ultra-processed foods can initiate an inflammatory response. Lastly, gut microbiome dysbiosis. So that's kind of telling you the difference in the amount of good versus bad bacteria in the gut. And it could be that ultra-processed foods throw off that microbiome. Okay, so we're going to transition now to talking about cleaner eating. So what are the health benefits from eating minimally processed or unprocessed foods? So first, we're going to kind of compare a couple of meals here. So here on the left, this could be a dinner that was a chicken breast, rice. We have some vegetables in there, some olives, some cheese, and a couple of spices, salt and pepper and oregano. So some of these foods are processed, some are unprocessed. Depends on what kind of rice you're using. That could be white. If it's white rice, that's going to be not a whole grain. But I would say altogether, this is a pretty good meal here. You've got lots of vegetables. In your olives, you're going to have lots of good fats in there. Olive oil, also a good fat. And then over on the right side, you're going to have fried chicken from the grocery store, mac and cheese, green bean casserole, which is homemade, and some rolls. So this sounds like a pretty good meal, but I will point out that most of these options are ultra processed foods. So if you are choosing to eat this meal, which there's not anything wrong with it per se, but you probably wouldn't want to eat that every day because you're really getting a lot of those ultra processed items and you're not getting a lot of the good benefits from fruits and vegetables and your whole grains here. So finally, we'll look at a third meal and see where does this lie on that spectrum. So here you're going to have seasoned ground beef patties, whole wheat buns, mixed fruit and 100% fruit juice, and baked beans and canned turnip greens. So you might say, oh, well, it kind of sounds like this might be a lot of ultra processed foods, but it's not. So I will say whole wheat buns, those are technically in the category of ultra processed foods. Your loaf breads are, but they're pretty safe, relatively. And it is fine to get your fruits and vegetables canned. If you need to be on a sodium restriction, one thing I would recommend to get rid of some of that excess sodium is just rinsing off your canned vegetables before you cook them. And that can be really helpful in limiting that sodium. But this would be a perfectly fine meal. There is not a lot of ultra processed stuff here. This is pretty much whole foods that have been preserved a little bit to extend their shelf life. So this would be a lot of foods in that group 3 category if we're talking about the NOVA classification. So we're going to talk about protective components in fruits and vegetables now. So what's in there that causes those good health benefits? And most of you probably know this, but they're going to be full of vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, and fiber. So this table is just showing kind of the wide range of phytochemicals that you're going to find in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. So there is increasing evidence that demonstrates the ability of phytochemicals to decrease inflammation, slow the growth rate of cancer cells, reduce the formation of carcinogenic compounds, those cancer causing compounds, regulate gene expression and hormones, intracellular signaling, and enhance your immune system and reduce DNA damage. So lots of really good things happening here with phytochemicals. Specifically about whole versus refined grains. So whole grain is going to contain the entire grain. So that consists of the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. Refined grains only have the endosperm, okay? So the bran and the germ are removed in the refining process. And when that happens, you are stripping that grain of a lot of nutrients. It's going to take out your B vitamins, it's going to remove your iron and your fiber. Enriched grains are going to have some of these added back in. It will have your iron and your vitamins added back in, but it will still lack a lot of the fiber and the phytochemicals that are found in whole grains. And we know that increased intake of less refined whole grain foods have lower risk of developing cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers. And finally, increased consumption of plant-based foods has protective effects against chronic disease. So including heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cataracts, age-related function decline. The 2010 dietary guidelines for Americans recommended that most people, based on a 2,000 calorie diet, should eat at least 9 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. And that 9 servings is 4 servings of fruit and 5 servings of vegetables. There was also a study in the same year, 2010, that found that the average consumption of fruits and vegetables in the United States was only 3.6 servings of fruits and vegetables combined So that was 1.4 servings of fruits and 2.2 servings of vegetables per person per day. And that was in 2010. So it could be even less now. So what about supplements? So clinical trials studying individual vitamins and phytochemicals don't tend to produce consistent evidence that explain why diets that are rich in fruits and vegetables and whole grains have these beneficial health effects. Trials that isolate the effects of these specific vitamins or compounds have mixed and sometimes even negative results. So that is telling us that the effects of these phytochemicals are probably additive and synergistic. So you need the whole fruit or the whole vegetable, the whole grain to get those good effects. You can't just take one thing out of there and put it in a supplement and say, hey, this is going to cure all your problems. You have to eat the whole thing to get these effects. So we know that it's most beneficial to health and longevity to eat a diet of whole and diverse foods rather than to use supplements. And if you are eating a diet of whole and diverse foods, you will not need to use supplements unless there is another issue going on. All right, finally, we are going to talk about moderation. So there are a lot of reasons why we eat food. It's not just because we're hungry or just to nourish our bodies. Those are two really good reasons why we eat. But other reasons can include rituals, holidays, social events, or just for taste and enjoyment. That's a good reason to eat. As you can see in this picture here, we have two people at the movie theater eating popcorn. I would say that's kind of a ritual to eat popcorn at the movies. It's also a social event for taste and enjoyment. You might not necessarily be hungry when you're eating popcorn at a movie theater, but it's just something that we do, and that's fine. So don't make it a diet. There is this thing called the restrict binge cycle. And we know that restricting entire food groups can lead to overeating or binging. And this has been found in different populations as well. And this is also kind of a point of research right now. So kind of what happens if you say, I'm not going to eat fried chicken ever again, you might start really craving that. And by restricting that from yourself, it's kind of creating a psychological situation that might lead you to overeat that food when you have it and eat way too much of it. Then you're going to feel really shameful about it, and then you're going to restrict it again. Now, this is not something that happens in everybody. Some people are more susceptible to this kind of cycle of thinking, but it's still important not to restrict entire food groups. So I would encourage you to think about clean eating as a lifestyle change to increase your nutrient consumption, to choose foods that have higher nutrient density. So how do we do that? I'm going to talk a little bit about goal setting. So SMART goals are a really good way to set a goal for yourself. And the SMART is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So we're going to talk about some examples of a SMART. Here's some good SMART goal examples that are specifically about limiting ultra processed foods. So the first one, I will limit fast food to once per week for the month of November. Now you may be looking at this and thinking once a week is still a lot, but everything is relative. Like say you were eating fast food 3 times a week. I think this would be a really good goal to start with. So saying I will limit fast food to once per week for the month of November. So you've got, it's time bound. You're going to be able to assess that goal after the month of November and see what happened. And then maybe you can make changes to that goal or extend it if you think you need more time with that specific goal. So that would be a good goal to start with. Second, we see I will pack my lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays next month instead of going to the cafeteria. Again, this is time bound. It's for next month. It's specific. It's just Tuesdays and Thursdays. This feels like an achievable goal. And then finally, from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Sundays, I will plan out dinners for the week without interruption. This is a good goal as well, because you might think meal planning seems really daunting, seems like it's going to be a lot. If you kind of put a time limit there. Maybe you don't get through the whole week. Maybe that hour doesn't get you all the way, but you've done something with that time. And then you can come back afterwards and see, do I need to shorten that? Do I need to lengthen that? How did that work out for me? So now we're gonna look at some not SMART goals. So first, I will meal plan for the week on Sunday. So if you don't have that time limit, you don't know when you're going to do it, it kind of seems overwhelming. And that would be a goal that probably you're not going to achieve. Second, I will check every food label of everything I eat to make sure I don't buy anything with more than 5 ingredients until the end of time. Not time bound, probably not achievable. This is probably not a goal that you would succeed at. And then lastly, I will never eat Chick-fil-A again. That is, again, in that category of restricting specific foods. I mean, Chick-fil-A is not a whole food group per se, but if you say I will never eat Chick-fil-A again, you're probably going to crave Chick-fil-A, and then you're going to feel shameful about it if you end up eating Chick-fil-A. Okay, so to summarize what we talked about today, I want to point out that clean eating is achievable. As long as you set those SMART goals for yourself, you can even think about it as cleaner eating if you feel like clean eating feels like a lot. Limiting ultra processed foods. And so we talked a little bit about food labels. If you're unsure if a food is ultra processed, you can look at that food label. If you see that there are things you don't recognize or see ingredients that you would not cook with, you're probably looking at an ultra processed food. Increase fruit and vegetable consumption. Hopefully we don't necessarily need to make it up to 9 servings tomorrow, but we could probably go up a little bit. Eating whole grains when able. Don't restrict yourself. And finally, make SMART goals when you're trying to change habits. It's going to make things a lot easier.